Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping briefly met on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. But as is often the case between the two countries, there were contradictory accounts of the encounter from the two sides. While China claimed that the two leaders met on India's request, top Indian government sources have refuted it and said there was a pending request from the Chinese side for a bilateral meeting. The sources said the two leaders had an informal conversation at the Leaders' Lounge during the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. India's Foreign Secretary Vinay Mohan Kwatra said India and China have agreed to step up efforts for the disengagement of troops and de-escalation of tensions along the line of actual control after a conversation between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. Now remember, the meeting took place on the 23rd of August. However, the announcement of the talks was kept under wraps until the next day, just prior to Prime Minister Modi's departure for Greece. While the two leaders had spoken briefly on the sidelines of the Bali G20 summit dinner last year about the need to stabilize the LAC, this is the first such conversation in the last 3 years where the two leaders spoke at some length on resolving the issue. A military standoff has been underway along the line of actual control since April 2020 after transgressions by the Chinese military and the killings that followed in Galwan in eastern Ladakh. The conversation between the two leaders could represent a thaw in ties that have been in limbo since the beginning of the standoff, with Indian officials maintaining that there can be no business as usual while the LAC situation persists. India's Foreign Secretary also said Prime Minister Modi had underlined that the maintenance of peace and tranquility in the border areas and observing and respecting the line of actual control are essential for normalization of India-China ties. In this regard, the two leaders agreed to direct relevant officials to intensify efforts at expeditious disengagement and de-escalation. All right, let's go back to Shri for more on this. Shri, as we know that there have really been no substantive talks between the two countries in the last 3 years, except for the military level talks that have taken place, and frankly, most people seem to think that even those haven't yielded much. But now that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi have met and spoken about the LAC on the sidelines of the BRICS summit, do you really believe this is likely to provide that much needed thaw in an otherwise frozen relationship, given that this comes on the eve of the G20 summit, where it is widely expected that President Xi Jinping will attend in person, and India, being the G20 host, will obviously need to play a certain kind of role. And then, of course, there is also speculation about the various bilaterals that could take place on the sidelines of the G20 summit itself.
So, Neha, I won't get too excited about this informal chat that happened between our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, and Xi Jinping. For a fundamental reason, Neha, because often what China says is at odds with what it does. We talked about the Galwan attacks. Now, even as these talks are happening, China has not stopped any kind of infrastructure or military buildup along the line of actual control. And if China were really serious about restoring relations with India, I think it would start by reappointing an ambassador. As you know, after Mr. Sun Weidong left India as the Indian ambassador, as a Chinese ambassador to India, they haven't really filled the post. So I think these are very important, gestures that China first needs to take before it can get ambitious and say that, we are willing to walk the, extra mile, but India is not coming. I think that's, no one will buy that kind of a pitch, Neha. Now, do I think that the border issues are intractable and they cannot be solved? I don't think so. Now, let's look at the other large country with which China had a problem, which is USSR. They had a problem going as far back as 1969. Excuse me. And that got resolved, just before the, 20 years ago. So, Neha, it is possible to solve border issues if there is seriousness on China's side. India, of course, has been willing. We have extended our hands, but you cannot have fights happening. You cannot have soldiers attacking Indian soldiers. and then say that we want peace, we want to talk. I don't think that duplicity will be accepted by India, Neha. And finally, I think the question President Xi Jinping needs to ask himself is, does he want to make China another global pariah like Russia at the moment? Because I think the people of China deserve much better than what is being offered to them at this stage, Neha. So I think it's up to Beijing to come forward and offer serious roadmap which is credible and which is convincing for India to walk along that roadmap and solve this border issue for once and all, like China did with Russia in as recently as 20 years ago, Neha.
Well, that is a legitimate question you ask. Does Xi Jinping want to turn China into another pariah like Russia? Well, we don't know really if she even cares about that. But, talking once again about the G20 summit, because we do expect the Chinese president to attend in person, while the focus or the agenda will be entirely different. It's a multilateral summit, and India, of course, as the host, keeps insisting that we're going to keep the focus on developmental issues and issues of the global south. But given that the Russia-Ukraine war is likely to come up inevitably thanks to the presence of countries like the United States, and then if you do have, let's say, the Indian and the Chinese leaders holding talks on the sidelines, do you believe that we are going to see more of the same, really, as far as these conversations about the line of actual control are concerned? So basically, would it be safe to say that one should really not harbor too much optimism, whether it is, the talks that happen at the BRICS summit or the talks that are likely to happen on the sidelines of the G20 summit? We should really keep our expectations in check. Is that what you would say?
Absolutely, Neha. I mean, let's look at what happened when the G20 Kashmir leg was happening. China came out and said that it will not, attend a meeting that's being held in a disputed territory. I mean, China is not even involved. I mean, it has nothing to do with that issue. If China were to make all these an issue and get into matters that don't really, involve it, then I think the scope for any kind of resolution or any kind of genuine talks, the room gets reduced, Neha. So I think China needs to do a lot of soul searching and come up with some sort of proposal which is acceptable to India, and especially in the context of China getting isolated and getting boycotted in some sense by Western nations. I think it cannot afford to make too many enemies. I think it needs to come forward and talk to India and solve this issue once and for all. I think that's very important for China's own future, not just economic growth, but also its political stability and its position in this part of the world, Neha.
Well, I agree with you 100%. But remember what Xi Jinping said at the BRICS summit? Hegemonism is not in China's DNA.